Jake Morrison stared at the glass doors of the Riverside Animal Shelter as his mother, Linda, parked their hover car in the designated spot. The building looked ordinary enough with its clean white walls and blue trim, but Jake felt his stomach twist with the same anxiety that had been eating at him for months. He did not want to be here, did not want to try another one of his mother's well-meaning attempts to make him feel better about his life. The wheelchair lift hummed as it lowered Jake to the ground level. Linda fussed with the controls, making sure everything was secure before they moved toward the entrance. Jake rolled his wheels forward slowly, each push feeling heavier than it should. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and the smell of disinfectant mixed with something else hit him immediately. It was not unpleasant, just different from what he expected. A woman with kind brown eyes and graying hair approached them from behind a curved reception desk. She wore a blue uniform with a name tag that read, Maria Santos, Director. Her smile seemed genuine as she extended her hand to Linda first, then turned to Jake with the same warm expression. "You must be Jake," Maria said, crouching down slightly so they were at eye level. "Your mother told me you might be interested in our volunteer program." Jake nodded without much enthusiasm. His mother had explained the whole thing during the drive over. The program was designed for people with disabilities who wanted to help care for rescue animals. The doctor said it might help with his depression, though Jake doubted spending time with abandoned pets would somehow fix the fact that his legs would never work again. Maria led them through a hallway lined with pictures of happy families holding various dogs and cats. Each photo had a small plaque underneath with adoption dates going back several years. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow that reminded Jake of his old bedroom before they had to move everything to the ground floor of their house. "We have about 40 animals here right now," Maria explained as they walked. "Most of them are dogs and cats, but we also have a few rabbits and even a parrot that someone surrendered last week. The volunteer work is flexible, and we can adjust everything to work with your mobility needs." They entered a large room filled with kennels of various sizes. The sound hit Jake immediately, barking, whining, and the occasional meow creating a constant background noise that somehow felt comforting rather than overwhelming. Several other volunteers moved between the kennels, filling water bowls and offering treats through the metal bars. Linda squeezed Jake's shoulder gently. "The doctor thinks this might help you feel more connected to things again," she said quietly. "You used to love animals when you were little, remember? You always wanted to bring home every stray cat in the neighborhood," Jake remembered, though it felt like those memories belonged to someone else entirely. The boy who had begged for a puppy every Christmas and spent hours watching nature documentaries seemed very far away from who he was now. That boy could run and jump and climb trees. This version of himself just sat in a chair and tried not to think about all the things he could no longer do. Maria stopped in front of a kennel containing a small beagle mix with one floppy ear. "This is Charlie," she said. "He came to us 3 months ago when his elderly owner passed away. He's very gentle and loves attention from visitors." Charlie wagged his tail and pressed his nose against the kennel door. Jake reached out automatically, letting the dog sniff his fingers through the metal mesh. The contact felt strange after so many months of avoiding physical interaction with almost everyone and everything. They moved to several more kennels, meeting dogs and cats of all ages and sizes. There was Bella, a golden retriever who had been returned twice because she was too energetic for her previous families. Princess was an older cat who purred loudly whenever anyone approached her cage. A young pit bull named Bruno had been rescued from a bad situation and was still learning to trust people again. Each animal had a story, Maria explained, and each one needed different kinds of care and attention. Some needed medical treatment, others just needed time to learn that humans could be kind. The volunteer work could involve anything from basic feeding and cleaning to simply sitting with animals who needed companionship. Jake listened politely, but felt disconnected from everything around him. The animals were nice enough, but he could not shake the feeling that he was just going through the motions to make his parents happy. Nothing seemed to spark any real interest or emotion in him. "There are a few more animals in the back area," Maria said, glancing at her watch. "They're some of our more challenging cases. Animals that need extra patience and care. Would you like to see them before you decide if this program might work for you?" Linda looked at Jake questioningly. Part of him wanted to say no, to tell them this whole thing was pointless and ask to go home. But something in Maria's tone made him curious despite himself. Maybe it was the way she said challenging cases. Or maybe it was just that he had nothing else to lose. Sure, Jake said, the first word he had spoken since arriving at the shelter. Maria led them down another hallway toward the back of the building. This area was quieter, with fewer volunteers and more space between the kennels. The lighting was softer here, and Jake noticed that several of the enclosures had extra bedding and what looked like hiding spots built into the corners. These animals need special care, Maria explained as they walked. Some have medical issues, others have behavioral problems from trauma or neglect. We work with them for as long as it takes, but they require volunteers who can be very patient and understanding. They stopped in front of a kennel that looked different from the others. It was larger, with solid walls on 3 sides instead of the open mesh design used elsewhere. A small window near the top allowed light in, but Jake could not see the animal inside from his position in the wheelchair. "This is our most difficult case," Maria said softly. "His name is Rex, and he came to us 6 weeks ago. He was rescued from an illegal fighting operation on one of the Mars colonies. The transport ship brought him here because we specialize in trauma cases." Jake rolled his chair closer to the kennel door. Through the small viewing window, he could see a large dog pressed against the far wall. Even from this distance, Jake could tell the animal was scared. The dog's body language reminded him of something, though he could not quite place what it was. "He hasn't allowed anyone to touch him since he arrived," Maria continued. "He barely eats, and he won't interact with any of our staff or volunteers. We're running out of options for helping him." Jake stared through the window at the cowering dog, and suddenly he understood what the animal's posture reminded him of. It was the same way Jake felt most days, pressed into a corner, wanting to hide from a world that felt dangerous and unpredictable. For the first time since his accident, he felt a connection to another living being. The next morning, Jake woke up thinking about the dog in the back kennel. He had dreamed about Rex during the night, though the details were fuzzy now that he was awake. All he remembered was the image of the large German shepherd pressed against the wall, trembling and alone. Linda was surprised when Jake asked to return to the shelter that afternoon. She had expected him to make excuses about why the volunteer program would not work out, the same way he had avoided every other activity she had suggested over the past 2 years. Instead, he sat quietly during breakfast and asked what time they could go back. "Are you sure?" Linda asked, studying her son's face for any sign of the enthusiasm he used to show for things he cared about. "You seemed pretty quiet yesterday after we left." Jake pushed his eggs around on his plate, not quite ready to explain what he was feeling. How could he tell his mother that he felt drawn to a traumatized dog, because they both knew what it was like to have their lives broken by circumstances beyond their control? It sounded ridiculous even in his own head. "I just want to see if I can help with that dog Maria showed us," he said finally, "the one that won't let anyone near him." Linda's expression shifted from surprise to concern. She had learned to be cautious about Jake's rare moments of interest in anything. Too many times over the past 2 years, his brief sparks of engagement had fizzled out quickly, leaving him more withdrawn than before. "Honey, Maria said he was their most difficult case," Linda said gently. "Maybe you should start with one of the friendlier animals like that beagle Charlie. You seem to connect with him." But Jake shook his head. He could not explain it, but something about Rex called to him in a way that the other animals had not. Maybe it was because Rex looked as broken as Jake felt inside. Maybe it was because no one else had been able to help him, and Jake understood what it felt like to be given up on. They arrived at the shelter just after lunch. Maria seemed pleased to see them back so soon, though she looked puzzled when Jake asked specifically to spend time with Rex. She led them back to the quiet hallway where the difficult cases were housed, walking slowly to accommodate Jake's wheelchair. "I have to warn you," Maria said as they approached Rex's kennel. "He's been here 6 weeks now, and he hasn't made any progress at all. Yesterday after you left, one of our most experienced volunteers tried to work with him again, and he wouldn't even look at her." Jake positioned his wheelchair in front of the kennel door and peered through the small window. Rex was in exactly the same spot as the day before, pressed against the back wall with his head low and his body tense. The dog's dark fur was scarred in several places, and Jake could see that part of his left ear was missing. "What happened to him exactly?" Jake asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. Maria's expression grew sad. "The fighting ring was using him as what they call a bait dog. They would put him in with the fighters to get them worked up and aggressive. He wasn't trained to fight back, just to survive whatever they did to him. Jake felt something twist in his stomach. The idea of someone deliberately hurting an animal for entertainment made him feel sick, but it also helped him understand why Rex was so afraid. The dog had learned that humans meant pain and danger. "Can I sit with him for a while?" Jake asked. "I don't want to go inside the kennel or anything. I just want to be near him." Maria glanced at Linda, who nodded slowly. "I suppose that couldn't hurt," Maria said. "But don't be disappointed if he doesn't respond. We've had volunteers sit with him before and he just ignores them completely." Linda kissed the top of Jake's head. "I'll be in the front office doing some paperwork for the volunteer program," she said. "Take as much time as you need." After they left, Jake was alone with Rex for the first time. The hallway was quiet except for the soft hum of the ventilation system and the distant sounds of other animals in the main area. Jake could hear Rex breathing, quick shallow breaths that spoke of constant anxiety. "Hey there," Jake said softly, keeping his voice low and calm. "I know you probably don't want to hear from another human right now. I get that. I don't really want to talk to most people either these days." Rex did not move or acknowledge that Jake had spoken. His eyes remained fixed on the floor, and his body stayed pressed against the wall as if he was trying to disappear into it. Jake settled back in his wheelchair and pulled out a book he had brought with him. It was one of his old favorites from before the accident, a simple adventure story about a boy and his dog exploring the wilderness. He had not read it in years, but something about the idea of reading to Rex felt right. "I used to love this book when I was younger," Jake said, opening to the first page. "It's about a kid named Alex who finds a wolf puppy in the woods. Everyone tells him wolves are dangerous, but Alex knows this one is different." He began reading aloud, keeping his voice steady and quiet. At first, Rex showed no reaction at all. But after several minutes, Jake noticed that the dog's breathing had slowed slightly. His posture was still tense, but some of the trembling had stopped. Jake read for nearly an hour, pausing occasionally to comment on the story or to speak directly to Rex. He told the dog about how Alex learned to communicate with his wolf friend without words, how they developed trust through patience and consistency rather than force. "The thing about Alex and the wolf," Jake said during one of his pauses, "is that they both knew what it was like to be misunderstood. Alex was different from the other kids in his town, and the wolf was different from other wolves because he had been raised by humans for a while. They found each other because they needed someone who understood." For just a moment, Jake thought he saw Rex's ears twitch slightly, as if the dog was actually listening, but when he looked more carefully, Rex seemed as withdrawn as before. When Linda returned to pick him up, she found Jake still reading. He was in the middle of a chapter where Alex and the wolf were learning to hunt together, developing the kind of partnership that required complete trust. "How did it go?" Linda asked quietly, not wanting to startle Rex. Jake closed the book and looked through the window at the dog one more time. Rex was still in the same position, but something felt different. Maybe it was wishful thinking, but Jake thought the dog looked slightly less frightened than he had an hour earlier. "I want to come back tomorrow," Jake said, "and the day after that, however long it takes." Linda studied her son's face and saw something she had not seen in months, a sense of purpose. Jake had not shown this kind of determination about anything since his accident. She was not sure what was happening between her son and the traumatized dog, but she recognized that this was important to Jake in a way that nothing else had been. "Okay," she said simply. "We'll come back tomorrow." As they left the shelter that afternoon, Jake was already planning what he would read to Rex the next day. He had a feeling that the dog was listening, even if he was not ready to show it yet, and for the first time since his accident, Jake felt like he had found something worth fighting for. The third day was when Jake first noticed the change. Rex was still pressed against the back wall of his kennel, but when Jake rolled his wheelchair into position and opened his book, the dog's head turned slightly toward the sound. It was such a small movement that Jake almost missed it, but he was watching carefully now, looking for any sign that his daily visits were making a difference. "Good morning, Rex," Jake said in the same quiet voice he had been using all week. "I brought a different book today. This one is about a space explorer who crash lands on an alien planet and has to learn to survive with the help of the creatures that live there." Rex's ears twitched at the sound of his name. Jake felt a small surge of excitement but forced himself to stay calm. He had learned that any sudden movement or change in his voice seemed to make Rex more nervous, so he kept his tone steady and relaxed. As Jake began reading, he noticed that Rex was no longer facing the wall completely. The dog's body was still pressed against the far side of the kennel, but he had shifted enough that one eye was pointed in Jake's direction. It was progress, tiny but real. Maria stopped by during Jake's second hour of reading that day. She had been checking on them regularly, though she tried to be subtle about it. Jake could tell she was surprised by his dedication to spending time with Rex, especially since the dog was showing so little obvious improvement. "Any changes?" Maria asked quietly, though she was already studying Rex through the window. "He's listening," Jake said with certainty. "He might not look like it, but I can tell he hears everything I'm saying." Maria looked skeptical but did not argue. She had seen enough traumatized animals over the years to know that recovery happened in small steps that were often invisible to outsiders. If Jake wanted to believe he was making progress with Rex, she was willing to let him try. After Maria left, Jake continued reading aloud. The story was about a human who had to earn the trust of alien creatures who had been hunted by other humans for generations. The parallels to Rex's situation were not accidental. Jake had chosen the book specifically because he thought the dog might relate to the themes of fear, trust, and healing. The explorer realized that the creatures weren't dangerous, Jake read. They were just scared because humans had hurt them before. So instead of trying to force them to trust him, he started by simply being present without asking for anything in return. Rex shifted again, this time turning his whole head toward Jake's voice. Their eyes met through the window for just a second before Rex looked away. But it was the first direct eye contact they had shared. Jake felt his heart beat faster with excitement. By the end of the week, Rex had moved from the back wall to the middle of the kennel. He still trembled when Jake first arrived each day, but the shaking stopped more quickly now. Jake had developed a routine of settling into his wheelchair, opening his book, and reading for exactly 2 hours before taking a break to talk directly to Rex about the story. "The thing about trust," Jake said during one of these conversations, "is that it can't be rushed. The explorer in the book learns that the hard way. Every time he tries to move too fast, the creatures run away and he has to start over." Jake was talking as much to himself as to Rex. He understood impatience intimately, the desperate desire to skip past the slow, difficult process of healing and jump straight to feeling better. But his accident had taught him that some things could not be forced or hurried. On Friday of that first week, something remarkable happened. Jake was reading a particularly exciting chapter, where the explorer was trapped in a cave with one of the alien creatures during a storm. Both of them were scared, but they had to work together to survive until the weather cleared. As Jake read about how the explorer and the creature began to communicate through gestures and shared actions rather than words, he heard a soft sound from Rex's kennel. At first he thought it might be whimpering, but when he looked up, he realized the dog had moved to the front of the kennel and was lying down just a few feet from the door. Rex was still tense and ready to flee, but he had chosen to come closer to Jake voluntarily. It was the first time he had approached any human since arriving at the shelter. Jake felt tears prick his eyes, though he blinked them away quickly. He did not want to do anything that might startle Rex back to the far wall. Instead, he continued reading in the same calm voice, pretending that nothing had changed even though his heart was racing with joy. When Linda arrived to pick him up that afternoon, she immediately noticed the difference in Rex's position. The dog was still wary, but he was no longer hiding in the back corner of his kennel. "Jake," she said softly, amazement clear in her voice. "Look at him." "I know," Jake replied, closing his book carefully. "He's starting to trust me." That weekend, Jake could barely contain his excitement about returning to the shelter on Monday. He spent Saturday and Sunday thinking about Rex, wondering if the dog would remember their progress or if he would retreat back to the wall over the weekend. Linda watched her son with a mixture of hope and concern. She had not seen Jake this animated about anything since his accident, but she worried about what would happen if something went wrong with Rex. Jake was investing so much emotional energy in this relationship that she feared the consequences if it did not work out. "What if he's not ready for visitors on Monday?" Linda asked gently on Sunday evening. "Sometimes animals have good days and bad days just like people do." Jake considered this seriously. He had been thinking the same thing, but he had also learned something important about patience over the past week. Rex had taught him that progress was not always linear, that setbacks were part of the process rather than signs of failure. Then I'll just sit with him until he's ready again, Jake said simply. However long it takes. Linda realized that something fundamental had shifted in her son. For the first time since his accident, Jake was thinking about someone other than himself. His focus had moved from his own pain and limitations to Rex's needs and healing. It was exactly the kind of change his doctors had hoped for, though none of them had predicted it would come through a traumatized dog who was afraid of human contact. When Monday arrived, Jake was at the shelter as soon as it opened. He rolled his wheelchair down the familiar hallway toward Rex's kennel, wondering what he would find. His hands were shaking slightly with nervousness as he positioned himself in front of the door and looked through the window. Rex was lying in the middle of the kennel, exactly where he had been on Friday afternoon. When he heard Jake's wheelchair, the dog lifted his head and looked directly at him through the glass. There was still fear in Rex's eyes, but there was also something new, a flicker of recognition and maybe even anticipation. "Good morning, Rex," Jake said, pulling out his book with steady hands. "Ready for the next chapter?" Rex's tail moved slightly against the floor of his kennel. It was not quite a wag, but it was the first voluntary movement Jake had seen from him that was not motivated by fear. They were both healing, Jake realized, each of them helping the other remember what it felt like to hope for something better. 3 weeks into Jake's daily visits, Rex began doing something that amazed everyone at the shelter. When Jake arrived each morning, the dog would move to the front of his kennel and wait. He was still nervous, still ready to flee if anything startled him, but he had learned to associate Jake's voice and presence with safety. Jake had finished reading 5 different books to Rex by now, and he was starting his 6th. The stories had become a way for them to communicate without the pressure of direct interaction. Through the adventures of fictional characters, Jake could talk about fear and courage, trust and betrayal, healing, and hope. "This new book is about a young knight who loses the use of his sword arm in battle," Jake explained as he opened to the first page. "Everyone thinks his fighting days are over, but he has to learn new ways to be brave and useful to his kingdom." Rex listened with the focused attention he had developed over their weeks together. His dark eyes never left Jake's face while he read, and occasionally the dog would tilt his head as if considering the meaning behind the words. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in Jake's 4th week of visits. Jake had been reading for about an hour when he reached for his water bottle on the small shelf attached to his wheelchair. His coordination was still not perfect since the accident, and sometimes his hands did not work exactly the way he intended them to. The bottle slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the quiet hallway. Water spilled across the tiles, and the bottle rolled several feet away from Jake's wheelchair. He stared at it in frustration, calculating whether he could reach it from his current position or if he would need to call for help. Before he could decide what to do, he heard movement from Rex's kennel. The dog had stood up and was approaching the door, something he had never done while Jake was watching. Rex pressed his nose against the metal mesh and made a soft whining sound. Jake looked at Rex in surprise. "What is it, boy? Are you okay?" Rex continued to whine and began pawing at the kennel door. His behavior was completely different from anything Jake had seen before, instead of fearful and withdrawn. The dog seemed agitated and purposeful. "I know the noise was loud," Jake said, trying to reassure him. "I'm sorry if it scared you. I just dropped my water bottle and I can't quite reach it." At the mention of the water bottle, Rex's behavior became even more intense. He scratched at the door and barked once, a sharp sound that brought Maria running from the front office. "What happened?" Maria asked, looking concerned as she hurried down the hallway. "I dropped my bottle and Rex started acting strange," Jake explained. "He's never made this much noise before." Maria studied Rex through the window, her expression puzzled. The dog was still focused on the kennel door, still making soft whining sounds and pawing at the metal mesh. "That's not fear behavior," Maria said slowly. "That's frustration. He wants to get out." Jake felt his heart skip a beat. "Do you think it would be safe to open the door?" Maria hesitated. Rex had never shown any signs of aggression, but he had also never shown any signs of wanting human contact. Opening the kennel could be a major step forward or a dangerous mistake. "Let me get some backup first," Maria said. "If we're going to try this, I want other staff members here in case something goes wrong." While Maria went to gather her team, Jake continued talking to Rex in soothing tones. The dog had calmed down slightly but was still focused on the door with an intensity that was completely new. "I don't know what you're thinking, boy," Jake said, "but if you want to come out here with me, I promise I won't hurt you. I know what it's like to be afraid of people trying to help when you're not ready for it." Maria returned with 2 other staff members, both experienced with difficult animals. They positioned themselves strategically around the hallway, while Maria slowly approached Rex's kennel door. "We're going to take this very slowly," Maria explained to Jake. "If Rex shows any signs of panic or aggression, I'm closing this door immediately," Jake nodded, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair nervously. Part of him was excited by the possibility of actually interacting with Rex directly, but another part was terrified that they were moving too fast and would undo all the progress they had made. Maria unlocked the kennel door and opened it just a few inches. Rex immediately pushed his nose through the gap, sniffing the air and looking directly at Jake. His tail was low but not tucked under his body, and his ears were forward rather than flattened against his head. "Easy, Rex," Maria said softly. "Take your time." Rex squeezed through the partially open door and stood in the hallway for a moment, looking around nervously. Jake held his breath, afraid that any movement might send the dog running back to his kennel. But instead of fleeing, Rex walked slowly toward Jake's wheelchair. His movements were cautious but deliberate, and he kept his eyes focused on Jake's face. When he reached the spot where the water bottle had rolled, Rex gently picked it up in his mouth and carried it back to Jake. The hallway fell completely silent as Rex approached Jake's wheelchair and carefully placed the water bottle on the floor next to the front wheel. Then he sat down and looked up at Jake, his tail beginning to move in what was definitely a wag. Jake felt tears streaming down his face as he reached out slowly toward Rex. The dog watched his hand approach but did not move away. When Jake's fingers finally made contact with Rex's head, the dog closed his eyes and leaned into the touch. "Good boy," Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Such a good boy." Maria and her staff watched in amazement as Rex allowed Jake to pet him for several minutes. The dog, who had been too traumatized to accept any human contact, was now seeking affection from the teenager, who had spent weeks simply reading to him through a kennel door. "I've never seen anything like this," one of the staff members said quietly. "Rex has been here for almost 2 months, and this is the first time he's voluntarily approached any human." Jake continued stroking Rex's head and ears, marveling at how soft his fur was despite the scars that marked his body. Rex seemed to be enjoying the contact, his tail wagging more confidently and his body relaxing against Jake's wheelchair. "I think he was trying to help me," Jake said, looking down at the water bottle Rex had retrieved.
"He saw that I couldn't reach it and he wanted to bring it back to me." Maria shook her head in wonder.
After everything humans have done to hurt him, his first instinct was to help a human in need. That says something remarkable about his character. They sat together for another hour, Jake reading the rest of the chapter while Rex lay beside his wheelchair. Occasionally, Jake would pause to pet the dog or speak to him directly, and Rex would respond with gentle movements of his tail or by pressing closer to Jake's chair. When it was time for Jake to leave, Rex followed him to the front of the kennel but did not resist when Maria guided him back inside. He seemed to understand that this was temporary, that Jake would return the next day. As Jake and Linda drove home that afternoon, Jake could barely contain his excitement. He had touched Rex, had felt the dog's trust in the way he leaned into Jake's hand and wagged his tail. It was the first time since his accident that Jake had felt truly needed by another living being. "Mom," Jake said as they pulled into their driveway, "I think Rex and I are going to be okay." Linda smiled at her son, recognizing the hope in his voice that had been missing for so long. "I think you're both going to be more than okay," she said. "I think you're going to help heal each other." Jake was reading to Rex about a brave explorer who refused to abandon his injured companion when the emergency alarms began blaring throughout the shelter. The harsh electronic sound made Rex jump and press closer to Jake's wheelchair, but he did not run back to his kennel. After 6 weeks of daily visits, the dog had learned to trust that Jake would keep him safe, even when frightening things happened. Maria burst through the doors to the back area, her face pale and her hands shaking as she clutched a communication device. Behind her, Jake could hear other staff members shouting instructions and the sound of many feet moving quickly through the building. "Jake, we need to evacuate immediately," Maria said, her voice tight with controlled panic. There's been an emergency alert from Earth Defense Force. All civilians in this sector need to report to the mountain bunkers within the next 4 hours. Jake felt his stomach drop. He had heard about the alien ships that had been spotted at the edge of the solar system over the past few months, but the news reports had made them seem distant and unthreatening. Earth Defense Force had assured everyone that the planet's protective grid was more than capable of handling any potential threats. What kind of emergency? Jake asked, though part of him already knew the answer from the fear in Maria's eyes. The alien fleet has broken through the outer defensive line, Maria said. They're heading straight for Earth, and early reports suggest they're not interested in negotiation. Every civilian facility in the potential impact zones has been ordered to evacuate to the underground shelters. Rex seemed to sense the tension in the room and began whining softly. Jake reached down to stroke the dog's head, trying to provide comfort even as his own mind raced with questions and fears. "What about the animals?" Jake asked. "We can't just leave them here." Maria's expression became even more strained. "The evacuation transports are only authorized to carry human civilians," she said. "There's no space for animals, and the emergency protocols don't include provisions for pets or shelter animals." Jake stared at her in shock. "You mean we're just going to abandon them? All of them?" "We don't have a choice," Maria said, though Jake could see how much the words hurt her to say. "The transport shuttles are already overloaded with human refugees from the outer settlements. There's literally no room for anything else." Jake looked down at Rex, who was gazing up at him with the trusting expression he had developed over their weeks together. The dog had no way of understanding what was happening, but he could clearly sense that something was very wrong. "Rex comes with me," Jake said firmly. "I don't care what the protocols say. He's not staying here alone." Linda had arrived during the conversation and overheard Jake's declaration. Her face was tight with worry, but Jake could see that she understood his position. Rex was not just a shelter animal to Jake anymore, he was family. "Honey, the transport guidelines are very strict," Linda said gently. "They're designed to save as many human lives as possible. There might not be any way to bring Rex." "Then I'm not going either," Jake said, his voice rising with determination. "Rex trusted me to keep him safe. I'm not breaking that promise just because some bureaucrat decided his life doesn't matter." Maria stepped forward, her expression thoughtful. "There might be a way," she said slowly. "Service animals are sometimes allowed on emergency transports if they're medically necessary for their human companions. If we could classify Rex as a therapeutic support animal for your disability-related needs." Jake's father, Dan, arrived at that moment, still wearing his Earth Defense Force uniform. His face was grim as he surveyed the situation, taking in Jake's distressed expression and Rex's position pressed against the wheelchair. "We need to move now," Dan said. "The last transport leaves in 90 minutes and the roads are already getting jammed with evacuation traffic." "Dad, I need to bring Rex," Jake said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "He's not just a pet. He's my therapy animal, and I can't function without him." Dan looked skeptical, but Linda quickly explained how much progress Jake had made since he started working with Rex. She described how Jake had become more engaged, more willing to leave the house, more hopeful about his future. "The boy hasn't shown this much life in 2 years," Linda said urgently. "Rex isn't just helping Jake cope with his disability. He's helping him want to live again." Dan studied his son's face, seeing the determination there that had been missing since the accident. He also saw how Rex was positioning himself protectively next to Jake's wheelchair, as if the dog understood that they needed to stay together. "I can authorize Rex as a medical support animal," Dan said finally, "but he'll need to stay calm during transport. And if there are any problems with space or safety, the animal protocols might have to take priority." Jake felt a rush of relief and gratitude. "Rex will be good," he promised. "He trusts me and I can keep him calm." The next hour was a blur of activity as they prepared for evacuation. Maria and her staff worked frantically to set up emergency care for the animals that would have to remain at the shelter, providing extra food and water in case the evacuation lasted longer than expected. Jake stayed with Rex throughout the preparations, keeping the dog calm with a steady stream of quiet conversation. Rex seemed to understand that something major was happening, but he remained focused on Jake rather than panicking about the noise and movement around them. "We're going on a trip together," Jake explained to Rex as they waited for their turn to board the transport shuttle. It might be scary and we might be in a strange place for a while, but we'll be together the whole time. Rex pressed against Jake's leg and looked up at him with complete trust. The dog had learned that Jake's presence meant safety, and as long as they were together, Rex could handle whatever came next. The transport shuttle was crowded with families carrying emergency supplies and children who did not fully understand why they had to leave their homes so suddenly. When Jake rolled aboard with Rex walking calmly beside his wheelchair, several passengers looked nervous about sharing space with a large dog. "He's a certified support animal," Dan explained to the transport coordinator. "Medically necessary for my son's condition." The coordinator looked at Rex dubiously, but the dog's calm behavior and obvious bond with Jake seemed to reassure him. Rex settled down next to Jake's seat without any fuss, resting his head on Jake's foot as the shuttle prepared for takeoff. As the transport lifted off and headed toward the mountain bunkers, Jake looked out the window at the animal shelter growing smaller below them. He thought about all the dogs and cats they had left behind, and his heart ached for them. But he also felt a fierce protectiveness toward Rex, who had trusted him enough to leave the only home he had known since his rescue. "I won't let anything happen to you," Jake whispered to Rex as the shuttle climbed higher into the atmosphere. "We're going to get through this together." Rex's tail thumped once against the floor of the shuttle, and Jake knew that the dog believed him. They had found each other in their brokenness, and now they would face whatever came next as a team. Whatever the aliens brought to Earth, Jake and Rex would meet it together. The underground bunker system beneath the Rocky Mountains was a marvel of engineering that Jake had only read about in school textbooks. Carved deep into solid rock and designed to house thousands of civilians during planetary emergencies, the tunnels stretched for miles in all directions. But living in them was nothing like the sterile descriptions Jake remembered from his history classes. The air was thick and recycled, carrying the smell of too many people in too small a space. Emergency lighting cast everything in a harsh blue glow that made everyone look tired and worried. Children cried constantly, their voices echoing off the stone walls. Adults spoke in hushed, anxious tones about what might be happening on the surface. Rex had handled the initial descent into the bunkers better than Jake had expected. The dog stayed close to Jake's wheelchair as they navigated the crowded processing areas where evacuees were assigned living spaces and given emergency supplies. But Jake could see the stress in Rex's posture and the way his ears twitched at every unfamiliar sound. Their assigned area was a small alcove carved into the tunnel wall, barely large enough for Jake's wheelchair and the thin mattresses provided for his parents. Other families were crammed into similar spaces all along the main corridor, with only hanging blankets to provide any privacy. "This is temporary," Linda assured Jake as she tried to arrange their few belongings in the cramped space. "The defense force says the bunkers are just a precaution while they deal with the alien threat." But Jake could see the doubt in his mother's eyes, and he noticed that his father spent most of his time huddled over his communication device, receiving updates that he did not share with the rest of the family. Rex adapted to their new environment with the same careful attention he had shown during his recovery at the shelter. He learned the layout of their section of the bunker quickly, memorizing the locations of the bathroom facilities, the food distribution area, and the main gathering spaces. Most importantly, he seemed to understand that his job was to stay close to Jake and provide comfort during a frightening time. The other evacuees had mixed reactions to Rex's presence. Some people were afraid of the large, scarred dog and asked Jake to keep him away from their children. Others were comforted by Rex's calm demeanor and would stop to pet him when Jake took him for walks through the tunnel system. "That dog has been through hell," commented an elderly woman named Betty who had been assigned the alcove next to theirs. "But look how gentle he is with everyone, especially you. That says something about both of your characters." Jake appreciated Betty's kindness, but he could see that not everyone felt the same way. Some evacuees complained to the bunker administrators about allowing animals in the emergency shelters, arguing that Rex was taking up space and resources that should go to humans. The complaints stopped abruptly on their third day underground, when Rex demonstrated abilities that surprised everyone. Jake was taking Rex for their evening walk through the main tunnel when the dog suddenly stopped and began acting agitated. His ears perked up and he turned his head toward the ceiling, whining softly and pawing at Jake's wheelchair. "What is it, boy?" Jake asked, though he could not hear or sense anything unusual. Rex continued his anxious behavior, pacing in small circles and looking upward. Other people in the tunnel began to notice the dog's strange actions, and several stopped to watch what was happening. "Maybe he needs to go outside," suggested one man. "Dogs don't like being cooped up underground like this." But Jake had learned to read Rex's body language over their months together, and this was not restlessness or claustrophobia. This was the same alertness Rex had shown at the shelter when he was responding to something that worried him. Suddenly, the bunker's alarm system activated. Red lights began flashing along the tunnel walls, and an automated voice announced that aerial threats had been detected approaching the mountain region. All evacuees were ordered to move to the deepest sections of the bunker immediately. "He heard them coming before our sensors did," Dan said in amazement as he helped guide Jake's wheelchair toward the inner tunnels. His hearing must be incredibly sensitive from his time in the fighting rings. Rex had positioned himself at the front of Jake's wheelchair and was leading them through the maze of tunnels toward the secure areas. The dog seemed to know exactly where they needed to go, navigating the crowded corridors with purpose and confidence. As they settled into the reinforced inner chamber that would protect them from any surface attacks, other evacuees began looking at Rex with new respect. The dog who had been seen as a burden was now clearly an asset to their survival. "How did he know?" asked a young mother who was holding her crying baby. "The alarms didn't go off until after he started acting strange." Jake stroked Rex's head proudly. "He's been trained to survive in dangerous situations," he explained. "He knows how to recognize threats before they become obvious to everyone else." Over the following days, Rex's early warning system proved invaluable. He would alert them to incoming aircraft, underground tremors from surface explosions, and even changes in air pressure that indicated problems with the bunker's life support systems. The dog who had been afraid of his own shadow was now helping to protect hundreds of people. More importantly for Jake, Rex's behavior during the crisis showed him something profound about courage and loyalty. Despite his traumatic past, despite his fear of loud noises and sudden movements, Rex consistently put himself between Jake and any perceived danger. When a section of tunnel collapsed during one particularly intense bombardment, Rex immediately moved to shield Jake's wheelchair from falling debris. When a group of panicked evacuees pushed through their area during an emergency drill, Rex stood firm beside Jake's chair to prevent him from being knocked over in the chaos. "He's not just protecting you," Linda observed one evening as they watched Rex maintaining his vigilant position beside Jake's sleeping area. "He's protecting all of us, but you're his priority, his reason for being brave." Jake felt a deep sense of responsibility and gratitude toward Rex. The dog had taught him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of fear when someone you cared about needed protection. "We take care of each other," Jake said simply, running his fingers through Rex's fur. "That's what family does." As the days underground stretched into weeks, Jake noticed other changes in both himself and Rex. The cramped conditions and constant stress were difficult, but they had each other to lean on. Jake found himself thinking less about his own limitations and more about how he could help Rex stay calm and comfortable. Rex, meanwhile, seemed to be gaining confidence from his role as protector and early warning system. The dog who had once cowered from human contact was now actively seeking out interaction with other evacuees, offering comfort to frightened children and companionship to lonely adults. "Look at that," Dan said one afternoon as they watched Rex gently play with a group of children who had been too scared to sleep the night before. "He's becoming the therapy dog this whole bunker needs." Jake smiled, feeling proud of how far Rex had come from the terrified animal he had first met at the shelter. But he also recognized that Rex's transformation was connected to his own growth. By focusing on helping Rex heal, Jake had discovered his own capacity for strength and purpose. When the all-clear signal finally came and evacuees were allowed to return to the surface, Jake felt mixed emotions about leaving the bunkers. The experience had been frightening and difficult, but it had also shown him and Rex what they were capable of when they worked together. As they emerged into sunlight for the first time in weeks, Rex stayed close to Jake's side but no longer seemed afraid of the world around them. They had faced crisis together and discovered that their bond was strong enough to protect them both. The return to the surface revealed a world that looked almost normal, but felt completely different. The alien ships had been driven back by Earth's defense forces, but everyone knew this was only a temporary victory. Intelligence reports suggested the Valkyrie were regrouping for a larger assault, and this time they would be better prepared for human resistance. Jake and his family returned to their home to find it undamaged, but somehow smaller than he remembered. After weeks in the cramped bunker tunnels, their house felt too quiet and too empty. Rex seemed equally unsettled by the change, pacing through the rooms as if checking for threats that might be hiding in familiar places. The most disturbing news came during Dan's first briefing back at Earth Defense Force headquarters. The Valkyrie had not been attacking randomly during their initial assault. They had been conducting detailed scans of human settlements, specifically looking for individuals with physical disabilities or medical conditions. Their communications were partially decoded, Dan explained to his family that evening over dinner. The Valkyrie view disabled humans as genetic defects that weaken the entire species. They believe that eliminating what they call inferior specimens will make humans easier to defeat in future conflicts. Jake felt a chill run through him as he processed this information. The aliens were not just trying to conquer Earth, they were trying to systematically murder people like him. How many others know about this? Jake asked quietly. The information is being kept classified to prevent panic, Dan said. But disability rights groups are already demanding that people with disabilities receive priority protection in any future evacuations. Rex sensed the tension in the room and moved closer to Jake's wheelchair. The dog had become even more protective since their return from the bunkers, as if he understood that the danger was far from over. That night, Jake lay awake thinking about the Valkyrie philosophy and what it meant for his future. He had spent the past 2 years struggling with feelings of worthlessness because of his paralysis. Now there was an entire alien species that wanted to kill him for the same reason. But something had changed in Jake during their time in the bunkers. Watching Rex transform from a broken, frightened animal into a confident protector had shown Jake that trauma and disability did not define a person's value. Rex's scars made him more compassionate, not weaker. His past suffering had taught him to recognize when others needed help. Over the following weeks, Jake threw himself into preparing for the inevitable return of the Valkyrie forces. He researched everything he could find about the aliens, studying their technology, their tactics, and their apparent weaknesses. Most importantly, he worked with Rex to develop their communication and teamwork skills. Jake had noticed that Rex's early warning abilities were not random. The dog seemed to be responding to specific sounds and vibrations that human senses could not detect. If they could learn to interpret Rex's signals more precisely, they might be able to predict Valkyrie movements before the aliens realized they had been detected. He's not just hearing the ships, Jake explained to his parents as he showed them the charts he had been making of Rex's behavior patterns. He's detecting the specific frequency signatures of their engines. Each time he alerts us, I've been noting the exact type of aircraft that appears and how long it takes to arrive. Linda looked at the detailed notes her son had compiled, amazed by the scientific rigor he was applying to understanding Rex's abilities. Jake, this is incredible work. Have you considered sharing this information with the Defense Force? Jake had been thinking the same thing, but he was nervous about drawing official attention to himself and Rex. He worried that military officials might want to separate them to study Rex's abilities, or worse, that they might view Jake as a liability because of his disability. His fears proved unfounded when Dan brought home news of a new Defense Force initiative. Command was looking for civilian volunteers who had demonstrated exceptional skills during the evacuation period. The program was specifically designed to utilize abilities that traditional military training could not replicate. They want to interview you and Rex, Dan said, trying to keep the pride out of his voice. Several bunker administrators filed reports about Rex's early warning capabilities and your ability to keep him focused during crisis situations. The interview took place at a secure facility outside the city, where Jake and Rex were evaluated by a team of military scientists and animal behavior specialists. Jake was nervous at first, worried that he would not be able to demonstrate Rex's abilities on command. But Rex seemed to understand the importance of the situation. When the scientists activated recorded Valkyrie engine sounds at frequencies too high for human hearing, Rex immediately went into his alert posture and moved to position himself protectively near Jake's wheelchair. Remarkable, said Dr. Grace Peterson, the lead researcher on the project. He's not just hearing the sounds, he's interpreting them and responding with appropriate protective behavior. This suggests a level of intelligence and training that we rarely see in animals. Jake explained how Rex had developed these skills during his time in the illegal fighting rings, where survival depended on being able to detect threats before they became obvious. The trauma that had made Rex afraid of humans had also taught him to be extraordinarily sensitive to danger. The question is whether we can use these abilities to help protect other civilians, Dr. Peterson said. Would you be willing to work with us to develop an early warning network using Rex's detection capabilities? Jake felt a surge of excitement and purpose that he had not experienced since before his accident. For the first time, his disability was not being seen as a limitation, but as part of a unique partnership that could help save lives. Rex and I are ready to help however we can, Jake said, reaching down to stroke the dog's head. We've learned to take care of each other. Now we want to take care of everyone else too. The training program that followed was unlike anything Jake had ever experienced. He and Rex worked with teams of engineers to develop communication systems that could translate Rex's alerts into actionable intelligence. They practiced evacuation procedures and learned to coordinate with other human-animal teams that were being formed. Most importantly, Jake learned that he was not alone. There were other disabled civilians who had demonstrated exceptional abilities during the crisis. And there were other animals who had shown remarkable intelligence and loyalty under pressure. The Valkyrie think disability makes us weak, said Captain Lisa Rodriguez, who had lost her sight in a training accident, but had developed enhanced hearing that rivaled Rex's capabilities. They're about to learn how wrong they are. As reports came in of Valkyrie ships massing at the edge of the solar system for another assault, Jake felt ready for whatever was coming. He and Rex had found their purpose, and they were no longer afraid of being seen as broken or worthless. They were a team, scarred but strong, and they were going to show the Valkyrie that humanity's greatest strength came not from perfection, but from the bonds they formed with each other in spite of their imperfections. The Valkyrie returned to Earth 3 months after their first assault, bringing with them a fleet 10 times larger than before. Their ships descended through the atmosphere like a dark cloud, blocking out the sun and casting the world into an artificial twilight. This time, they were not conducting reconnaissance or testing human defenses. They had come to finish what they started. Jake and Rex were stationed in the primary evacuation bunker beneath Denver, part of the early warning network that had been established using Rex's detection abilities and those of dozens of other specially trained animals. The system had worked flawlessly during practice runs, but none of them knew how it would perform under the pressure of actual combat. Rex sensed the Valkyrie ships long before they appeared on any human detection equipment. The dog's ears perked up and he moved into his alert position beside Jake's wheelchair, his body tense with the focused attention Jake had learned to recognize. "Contact," Jake said into his communication headset, following the protocols they had practiced. "Rex is detecting incoming aircraft bearing northwest. Estimated arrival in 12 minutes. Across the network, similar reports came in from other human-animal teams. The early warning system was providing Earth's defense forces with crucial advance notice of Valkyrie movements, allowing them to position their fighters and ground weapons for maximum effectiveness. But the Valkyrie had learned from their previous encounter with humans. This time, their ships were equipped with scanning technology specifically designed to penetrate underground bunkers and identify disabled individuals hiding below. Jake felt his heart racing as emergency lights began, flashing throughout the bunker system. Over the communication network, he could hear reports that Valkyrie ground forces were breaching the outer defenses and moving toward the civilian shelters. All teams with disabled members report to secure positions. Immediately came the order from command. Priority targets are to be moved to maximum protection areas. Jake understood what this meant. The Valkyrie were hunting people like him, and the defense strategy involved hiding disabled civilians as far from the fighting as possible. It made tactical sense, but it also meant abandoning the early warning posts just when they were needed most. "Negative," Jake said into his headset. "Rex and I are staying at our position. The detection network needs to stay operational." "Jake, you're a primary target," came the reply from Captain Rodriguez. "The Valkyrie will specifically search for you. You need to get to the deep shelters now." Rex seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. The dog moved closer to Jake's wheelchair and pressed against his leg, offering the same comfort and protection he had provided during their months of training. "If I hide, other people die," Jake said simply. "Rex can detect their movements better than any equipment we have. We're staying." The decision proved crucial when Valkyrie soldiers breached the main bunker entrance 20 minutes later. Rex immediately alerted Jake to their presence, allowing the human defenders to prepare for the assault. But the aliens moved with terrifying efficiency, their advanced weapons cutting through human defenses like they were made of paper. Jake watched through the security monitors as Valkyrie soldiers methodically searched the bunker corridors. They were not just looking for disabled humans. They were scanning every person they encountered, apparently able to detect physical conditions that were not immediately visible. The aliens reached Jake's section of the bunker faster than anyone had anticipated. Rex sensed them coming and positioned himself directly between Jake and the entrance to their post, his body language shifting from alert to aggressive for the first time since his rescue from the fighting rings. "Easy, boy," Jake said, keeping his voice calm despite the terror coursing through him. "We knew this might happen." The first Valkyrie soldier to enter their area was tall and thin, with pale gray skin and large black eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The alien carried a scanning device that immediately focused on Jake's wheelchair, emitting a high-pitched whine that made Rex growl with unmistakable menace. The Valkyrie soldier spoke in its own language, but a translation device on its equipment rendered the words in mechanical English. "Defective specimen identified. Genetic inferior confirmed for elimination." Jake felt a surge of anger that surprised him with its intensity. For 2 years he had struggled with feelings of worthlessness because of his paralysis. He had wondered if the world would be better off without him, if his disability made him a burden on everyone around him. But watching Rex position himself protectively in front of the wheelchair, seeing the absolute loyalty and love in the dog's scarred face, Jake suddenly understood something fundamental about value and worth. "You're wrong," Jake said to the Valkyrie soldier, his voice steady and clear. "I'm not defective. I'm different, and that difference makes me stronger, not weaker." The alien raised its weapon toward Jake, but Rex moved faster than anyone had expected. The dog, who had once been too afraid to let humans touch him, launched himself at the Valkyrie soldier, with the precision and power of his fighting ring training. Rex's attack was not the mindless violence of an animal defending territory. It was the calculated action of a protector who understood exactly what he was fighting for. He knocked the alien's weapon aside and pinned the soldier to the ground, his jaws positioned near the Valkyrie's throat but not biting. The alien struggled beneath Rex's weight, its large eyes fixed on the scarred dog who had defeated a technologically superior opponent through sheer determination and loyalty. "This animal is damaged," the Valkyrie said through its translator, apparently confused by Rex's behavior. "Why does it protect a genetic inferior?" Jake rolled his wheelchair closer, with Rex maintaining his position over the fallen alien. "Because he understands something your species doesn't," Jake said. "Strength comes from caring about others, not from being perfect. Rex has scars and trauma, just like I have my disability. But those experiences taught us to value each other more, not less." More Valkyrie soldiers appeared in the doorway, their weapons trained on Rex and Jake. But they hesitated, apparently uncertain how to process what they were witnessing. "Your damaged specimens show loyalty to each other," one of them observed. "This behavior contradicts our understanding of genetic weakness." Jake seized the moment, knowing that this might be the only chance to communicate something important to the aliens. "That's because you're measuring the wrong things," he said. "You think physical perfection equals strength, but real strength comes from the connections we make with each other. Rex was broken when I found him, and I was broken when he found me. But together, we're stronger than either of us could be alone." The lead Valkyrie soldier studied Rex's protective posture and Jake's calm confidence with what might have been curiosity. "You claim that damage creates strength?" "I claim that surviving damage and choosing to help others creates strength," Jake corrected. Rex could have stayed afraid and angry forever because of what was done to him. Instead, he chose to trust me and protect people who needed help. "That's not weakness, that's courage." Rex remained motionless above the pinned soldier, demonstrating perfect control despite the presence of multiple threats. His eyes stayed focused on Jake, waiting for a signal about how to proceed. The moment stretched between them, human, dog, and aliens, as the Velkari tried to process a philosophy that contradicted everything their species believed about strength and value. Finally, the lead soldier spoke again. "We must report this anomaly to our commanders. The behavior of your damaged specimens requires further analysis." The Velkari withdrew from the bunker, apparently more interested in studying the unexpected behavior they had witnessed than in continuing their mission of elimination. Rex maintained his protective position until the aliens were completely gone, then moved back to Jake's side with his tail wagging slightly. "Good boy," Jake said, stroking Rex's head with hands that were finally steady again. "We did it, didn't we?" The Velkari retreat gave Earth's defense forces the opportunity they needed to launch a counterattack that drove the alien fleet back to the outer solar system. But Jake knew that the real victory had happened in that small bunker room, when a scared dog and a disabled teenager had shown an advanced alien species that their assumptions about strength and worth were fundamentally wrong. In the months that followed, Jake and Rex became symbols of something important: the idea that society's most vulnerable members were often its greatest sources of wisdom and courage. Jake returned to school with Rex as his certified companion, and together they visited other young people who were struggling with disabilities or trauma. The animal shelter where their friendship began was rebuilt and expanded, with Jake serving as a volunteer coordinator for programs that paired rescued animals with people who needed healing. Rex became the program's most successful therapy dog, his own scars serving as proof that broken things could become beautiful and strong. Jake often thought about the Velkari soldiers' confusion when Rex chose to protect, rather than abandon him. The aliens had expected damaged beings to be weak and isolated, but instead they had encountered loyalty, courage, and strength that came directly from shared experience of pain and recovery.